Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we are focusing on decarbonising the UK's vast building stock. The global building sector is one of the most essential, but also perhaps the most overlooked frontiers in the fight against climate change. Offices, homes, shops, schools and factories, they are where we live, where we work and where we gather, and they are the fabric of our society. But as highlighted by a new report from the Energy Transitions Commission, they are also responsible for a staggering 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's around 12.3 gigatonnes of CO2 in 2022 alone. And for context, that's more than the emissions from transport or from industry. And these emissions come not just from heating and cooling, but also from lighting and cooking and appliances, and even the materials and methods we use to build in the first place. But the good news is that we already have the solutions. In its powerful new report, Achieving Zero Carbon Buildings, Electric, Efficient and Flexible, the Energy Transitions Commission sets out a clear roadmap for transforming the sector, arguing that we can cut emissions while also improving the quality of life and reducing energy bills, but only if we act quickly and ambitiously. So, what needs to happen? How do we turn strategy into action? Well, today we're joined by Lord Adair Turner, Chair of the Energy Transitions Commission, to unpack the findings of this important new report, explore what's possible and understand the path towards zero carbon buildings future. So, Lord Turner, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Well, let's start with the big picture. The key priorities in your report are clear. We must electrify buildings, dramatically improve energy efficiency and construct new buildings using low carbon materials and smart design. But implementation is far from simple. So, Adair, why do buildings remain such a stubborn, hard to abate source of global emissions?
Well, I think the core of it is just the number of people involved in the decision-making process. So if, for instance, you looked at decarbonising steel production, it's challenging because it requires a lot of technology investment, and it is expensive to do, and it will mean more expensive steel. But you could get into one room in Europe the 100 people whom are all you need to have in that room to make the decisions. And if a small number of policymakers said, we're going to have a serious carbon price and a serious border carbon adjustment, and a series of, tens of major steel executives said, that's okay, you can do it. When you get to buildings and you say, okay, I want to decarbonize the UK residential building stock, you've got 25 million households. And each of those households is going to have to make a decision as to when it gets rid of its gas boiler, who provides the heat pump. They're going to have to arrange that one or other in a family is available when the builders turn up. There's just the hassle effect of it. There are lots of other things as well. There are the fact that when we build new buildings, we build them to extraordinarily different standards. Different countries in the world are less or better at actually imposing building standards. So it is really it's the complexity and the number of people involved.
Yeah. Because you highlight in the report a number of critical challenges. Heating, cooling, to clean cooking, commercial real estate and grid integration. But essentially what you're saying is this complexity that makes it so much harder compared to power or transport.
Yeah, it is the complexity. It's the number of decision makers. It's that the decision makers are often, residential homeowners or small businesses. I mean, when you think about, again, let's take an example, decarbonising shipping. There are, 5 really big container shipping companies in the world. They've got to make difficult decisions about whether to replace their engines in their ships that burn heavy fuel oil with ones that burn methanol or ammonia. But they have professional decision makers who sit in front of Excel spreadsheets working out the economics of this. when you've got, millions and millions of hundreds of millions of ordinary small business and residential homes, they don't spend their life. They're not professional managers of energy. Yeah. So we've got to try and get the implementation to work despite a hugely greater level of complexity.
And I think what the report stresses is exactly that. No, there is no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to building. So, but you have got some solutions. So can you unpack for us, how do you think the decarbonisation strategies differ when it comes to region by region differences and building types and I suppose in climate as well?
Well, some of it is the same and some of it at one level you could say is relatively straightforward. If you take all of the appliances other than heating and cooling, right? All of the lighting and the televisions and the washing machines and the dishwashers, essentially they use electricity. And if we decarbonize electricity production, we decarbonize them. The challenge there is therefore less can we decarbonize them, it's can we reduce the cost of it. But there is huge opportunity to improve the efficiency of washing machines, dishwashers, lighting, etc. And that's all about appliance standards, regulation. So at one level, that's easy to understand, and it's relatively the same across the world. You then get to cooling and heating. And interestingly, the technology you use is broadly speaking the same. It's a heat pump. And when you use a heat pump for heating in a northern climate, in high latitude climate, you're essentially just doing an air conditioner pointed the other way around. But there, the crucial thing is the overlap with the issue of building insulation, right? That the amount of electricity that you need to cool a house in a hot tropical area will crucially depend on how well insulated the home is. And similar for heating in high latitude countries. So that's where it overlaps with all the issues about how we build houses, both new houses and how we retrofit old ones.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get into the supply and the demand side levers perhaps a bit later on. But one issue which is quite often overlooked is the embodied emissions, those from the construction materials like steel and cement used to construct your structures. I say it's overlooked, but it's an issue that certainly was discussed in my recent podcast with Adrian Campbell on Change Building. So how can these issues be better factored into the total footprint of the building sector? Because it's quite, it's quite often something which is not top of mind.
Yes, of the 12 gigatonnes or so of emissions from the building sector, the majority are in-use emissions once you're operating, right. But 2.6 gigatonnes, so a fair amount, is embodied in the materials that you use to build a building. And most importantly, in the steel and in the cement.
Yeah. And the argument that Adrian was making on the podcast was that we have got really good control over that operational side now. We can manage that. We just need to focus on this embodied side.
Well, I think we've got a lot to do on the operational as well, but certainly true. The embodied is one where we need to focus. And by the way, you have to realize sometimes there are trade-offs, right? If you make a building with more concrete and thicker walls, right?
Yeah.
It will have better insulation and lower emissions in use, but it will require more when it was built. But there are lots and lots of opportunities which we set out in the report to build buildings more efficiently in terms of using less concrete, less steel, using other insulation materials alongside less concrete or steel, to use substitute materials such as timber. So there are a whole series of ways, but also, of course, we have to drive the decarbonisation of steel production and cement production. We have to, so we've got to encourage people who are designing buildings really to think about all the ways that we can design them for structural integrity and comfort, but using materials. But we've also got to create economic incentives for them to be using green steel and green cement, which we now know how to produce.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, in the report, you outline a combination of supply side and demand side solutions. And let's start with that supply side. I mean, how critical would you say that grid decarbonisation and the continued expansion of renewable generation is to the building sector's ability to, I suppose, electrify effectively?
Well, it's absolutely crucial because, of the 12 gigatonnes that you talk about, 9.5 are coming from the operations. And within that, the majority already is electric, right? The appliances, cooling is all electric, lighting is electric. So if you take those, clearly the crucial thing is by being more efficient, limit how much more electricity we need, but also to make sure that whatever electricity we use is zero carbon. The other sectors of the economy, it's all about electrifying and decarbonising simultaneously. So cooling, it's about efficiency and decarbonising electricity production. Heating, it's about moving from gas boilers to electric and then making that as efficiency as possible and decarbonising the input.
Yeah. Because, this call for clean electrification as the backbone of the net zero transition. The issue, I suppose, when it comes to buildings is ensuring that this growth of electricity demand, especially from heating and cooling, as you say, doesn't outpace outpace the grid decarbonisation, because otherwise you're going to be chasing its tail.
Well, that is true, and you can worry about it either way, right? So the answer is we've got to decarbonise the grids. And we've got to simultaneously electrify. Now, you used to have 10 years ago a group of people saying in the UK, oh, you shouldn't install a heat pump or electrify your heating because we haven't yet decarbonised the grid. But in the UK, the carbon intensity of our electricity has already gone down from 500 grams per kilowatt hour in 2010 to 125 in 2024. So we have 75% decarbonised the grid. And at that level, switching to a heat pump gives you a hugely lower carbon intensity of heating. So in many grids, we have already achieved sufficient decarbonisation to make electrification undoubtedly good. Indeed, one of the oddities of the UK is, for the last 15 years, we haven't been using any more electricity at all. We ought to be using more electricity so that we actually use up the big renewables capacity that we're going to have in place. Go over to China, and it's different. There and India, their electricity grid is still primarily coal. So they've got to drive the decarbonisation fast enough to make sure that they're putting clean electricity into their cooling and heating systems.
Yeah. But that, of course, brings us to the demand side, because, the question is what role, I suppose, does design and behavioural change play in reducing energy use? Because, how much can we realistically expect, those kinds of shifts, expect the public and owners to change their ingrained behaviours? Our addiction to gas boilers and cooking with gas.
Well, look, I think on gas boilers, the crucial thing is to stop the installation of new gas boilers, right? I think it's quite difficult when somebody's got a working gas boiler to say, take it out. But essentially, eventually gas boilers do wear out. And so the crucial thing is to focus on what happens at that end of life decision where your plumber comes in and says, well, I've serviced this every year for the last 15 years, but fundamentally, it's knackered, and you're going to have something new. We got to focus on making sure that trigger point, either because regulation has required it or because there's enough information and enough good offers that people say, yeah, that's the point where I move to a heat pump. And heat pumps will save people money. And heat pumps, and this is a crucial point we make in the report, they do not require you to have the perfectly insulated house. One of the crucial things here is not to make the best the enemy of the good. People sometimes say, well, it'd be great if we put heat pumps into passive houses and they'd hardly need to use electricity at all. But the fact is, I have put a heat pump into a brick-built cottage in Hampshire, built 100 years ago. Yes, it has double glazing. Yes, it has roof insulation, but I haven't done fancy stuff beyond that. And the heat pump works perfectly well. So it's very important we get that message over, that heat pumps work even in only moderately well-insulated houses.
Yeah, that is a very big challenge around that behaviour and getting people to buy into that. And I suppose that's one of the key roles, of organisations like the ETC. I mean, you describe it as a global coalition of leaders from across the energy landscape committed to achieving net zero emissions by mid-century. What's its background and how does it operate? How does it get that kind of message across?
Well, we have 50 members. We started in 2015, just after the Paris Climate Conference, with about 20 members. We've grown. Those members are a slightly eclectic mix of companies from many countries and many sectors. They include fossil fuel companies or oil and gas companies like Shell and BP and Petronas, but they include National Grid and Iberdrola, which owns Scottish Power, SSE. They include steel companies like ArcelorMittal. They include Chinese companies like Envision, that makes wind turbines, and Longji, that makes solar PV panels. This somewhat interesting combination has grown over the years, and those members pay membership fees, which fund the research that we do in the Central Secretariat, and we analyse what is required to get to net zero, and we do it in all sectors of the economy, in steel, in cement, in aviation, and in this report, in buildings. And once we've produced a report, we issue it. We do things like what I'm doing now. We try to use as many opportunities as possible to get the messages over to people, to politicians, to other businesses about what is now technologically possible and about the policies and actions required to seize that technological possibility.
Yeah. Well, it's great that people like you in your position of influence are so engaged, because your background, of course, has been in finance. You were the chairman of the Financial Services Authority during the 2008 financial crisis, widely credited with leading the UK out of that difficult period. You've had a career before that in banking, Chase Manhattan, McKinsey and Merrill Lynch. But you're also the first chairman of the UK's Committee on Climate Change when it was launched by Gordon Brown as part of the Climate Change Act in 2008. I mean, the Act established the committee as a statutory body tasked with advising government. I mean, has it been able to live up to its role? Are we getting there?
Well, I mean, we are getting there in the sense of the UK is achieving significant decarbonisation, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, in the power sector. I mean, a lot of people don't know that the UK, each kilowatt hour of electricity that you use in your house now has only as quarter as much CO2 emissions attached to it as it did only in 2010. And sometimes we just don't tell good stories. That's a good story about setting out to decarbonising something and achieving it.
I'm trying it. I'm trying.
I think what the UK Climate Change Act also achieved for many years was a political consensus around the need for and the possibility of decarbonisation. Now, I am worried that political consensus is now fraying, and we have seen the Conservative Party rejecting the idea of net zero. I think that's very unfortunate. And as I said in a debate in the House of Lords the other day, it's extraordinary because they're trashing their own record. I mean, that fall, which I've just described, decarbonising our electricity system, happened from 2010 to 2024, which you may just note is 14 years of Conservative government. Yeah. I think they should be saying and proud of what they achieved in that period.
But simultaneously, we also see the Trump administration pulling out of the Paris Accord and abandoning carbon reduction policies. I mean, are you concerned that globally this is going to sort of wither on the vine?
I don't think it's going to wither on the vine, because it can't wither on the vine, because climate change is a real big problem for a lot of people across the world. And therefore, you will see at what's called COP30 in Brazil this year, the Conference of the Parties, you will see many countries in the world saying, look, the US may not be here, but we've still got a problem and we're still going to coordinate to do it. Now, let's be clear. The US pulling out is a problem. It will set back the process. It means that the world will now warm more than it otherwise would. There will be more droughts. There will be more floods. There will be more people die as a result of that decision by Donald Trump to pull out of the process. And, sometimes in life, when bad things happen, you've got to recognize bad things happen. But I think a lot of the rest of the world will still be saying, look, we have a problem and we now have the technologies to fix this problem. So let's get on with it as fast as we can.
Yeah. And of course, you are no stranger to operating in a political environment, pulling wide colleges of thinking together. You've led the CBI for 4 years in the late 1990s, after all, bringing a big business community together. I mean, how easy do you think it is going to be to find consensus and drive political change in the net zero carbon world?
Well, the answer is international consensus on this is unbelievably difficult. And it always amazes me that we've achieved anything. I mean, let's think about what happens at a COP. At a COP, a conference of the parties, you get 180 countries, 190 from around the world, some of whom are at war with each other, some of whom are in a state of collapse, many of which are, disagreeing with one another about trade. And they have to try and agree something unanimously. And what we get is not a perfect result, but it's imperfect, but still very useful result. And these COPs have created a sense of direction and momentum, which have led countries to invest more in renewables. And the very process of investing in renewables has developed industries which have then reduced the cost of these renewables. So you have to operate in an imperfect world rather than regretting the fact that it isn't perfect.
But your background in finance clearly must indicate to you that the finance holds the key to securing all those deals, and it holds the key to the low carbon future that I suppose you're trying to promote. I mean, is that a fair assumption?
Well, clearly to get to net zero, you have to do a lot of investment in new technologies, and that has to be financed. And on the whole, as long as you have in developed countries carbon prices and regulation, the private finance sector will do the heavy lifting on finance. The big challenge on finance is that there are parts of the world where the cost of capital, the required rate of return for an equity investor, or the amount that a debt provider, a bank, will provide for debt finance is so high that it makes it difficult to justify the upfront investment. And that's why in those developing parts of the world, there's a hugely important role for development banks like the World Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Bank. And one of the things we need to see at Brazil this year is stronger commitments to mobilize this capital, which would, for instance, allow Africa to just build huge electricity systems on solar and batteries and never bother with the dirty phase of gas or coal en route to it.
Because I think the ETC estimates that we need, is it something like $3.5 trillion every year to be invested to get to net zero. I mean, for buildings specifically, I mean, how do we unlock that capital then?
Well, that is a crucial point, because it goes back to the point we started with, that when you're talking about new steel mills or new ships, financing means a relationship between the professional managers of a steel company and the people in banks and equity owners who deal with large corporates. And then there are deals done where, money is disbursed at, I'm going to lend you, £100 million in order to do this. When you get to, the residential home area, it's about 25 million homes all having to invest £10,000, right?
Yeah.
At the very top end of the income distribution, they'll have the liquid resources available. But then you've got a huge swathe of the middle income distribution where we need to be really creative about providing finance, for instance, which enables people to top up their mortgage to get hold of that money in order to make that investment, which will give them a lower a bill over time. And at the lower end of the income distribution, we will have to have subsidies. One of the challenges you face is that individuals' cost of capital varies by individuals. At the top end of the income distribution, the cost of that finance to you is, I was getting 3% in a bank account. So if I spend £10,000, I've given up 3%. At the bottom end of the income distribution, you don't have £10,000 in a bank account. And if you borrow £10,000 at the lower end of the distribution, you're borrowing it on a personal loan or a credit card at 20%. So we need a creative set of policies to make sure that as many people as possible can borrow money at 3% rather than 10 or 15.
Yeah.
And that if they literally can't afford to borrow money at all, there are direct subsidies.
It's hugely important important work, but your career, Adair, has been filled with important work. I mean, how does this stack up in the kind of the Lord Turner list of life milestones?
I think this is the one that fascinates me most. You know, the work dealing with the financial crisis in 2008 was fascinating, important, and energizing. And, you know, it seems wrong to say I enjoyed it because, you know, it's a crisis, but, you know, I felt I was doing something important. And I think we did a good job at stabilizing the situation in autumn 2008 and then putting in place regulations which make it at least less likely that we'll do something so idiotic again for at least for a few decades. But I have to say, when we get to 2100, I don't think people, you know, there will be a story about the financial crisis of 2008. I don't think it'll be core to the history books of the world. But I think whether or not we deal with this problem of climate change is fundamental. And I think it's more fundamental than dealing with that financial. The financial crisis was something created by our own idiocy as to what we did in the financial system. And there were an achievable set of fixes which dealt with the problem fairly effectively. Climate change is a far more fundamental problem. Our use of fossil fuels has been wonderful for humanity. It's the only way that we've managed to get to this level of prosperity across the world and reduction of poverty. But we've now got to move beyond it. We've got to move to a new technology. This is a fundamental transition, and it's in a sense a bigger challenge. It's a much more difficult challenge. You can't work at it for a couple of years and then say, oh, good, I feel good. We've sort of done the job in a way that I felt we did do in 2008. And all one can individually do is play a relatively small role along with lots of other people in getting to a solution. But it's sufficiently vital for humanity that I find it an energizing thing to be involved in.
Fantastic. Well, certainly that comes across in space. Going back to the report, because there's a lot of really important messages in them. We've talked a lot about the demand and supply side. One of the things that you touched on was the need for cost-effective insulation to reduce demand for energy. What's holding it back? Why is uptake still so slow?
Well, there are two reasons why insulation is important, and the second one may be even more important than the first. One is that if you're better insulated, you don't need to use as much energy either to heat or to cool your house. The other, however, is that if you're better insulated, you could switch off your heating at 7 o'clock in the evening and switch it back on at 10 o'clock. And what you would do by then is shifting your electricity demand away from the time when everybody else is using electricity. And it's a crucial part of renewable-dominated systems that a lot of the cost of both generation and the cost in the grid, is driven by peak electricity usage. So the better we insulate your homes, the better that people can say, I'm going to sign up to a time of day varying tariff, such as people like Octopus provide, and I am going to save money by switching off my heating, at that particular time of day. So insulation is hugely important. And there are lots of things that people can do. Make sure you've got double glazing, make sure you put a lot of stuff in the loft, etc. But you don't need to go all the way. And our attitude should be on new build, we should get to a very, very high level of insulation standard. And if you do it at the new build process, it doesn't cost much because you're getting it right first time. It's always more expensive when you come back and retrofit. And the new build, there should just be very tight regulations. You shouldn't be allowed to build a house in the UK or in any other developed country which isn't done to very high insulation standards, because that will be for the benefit of climate, but it will also be for the benefit of consumers. They'll spend less on electricity.
Making that link between insulation and actually reducing the stress on the grid is a really important point, I think. Commercial buildings, though, often fly under the radar when it comes to these conversations. How do we create stronger market demand for high-performance commercial buildings, to enable large real estate investors or occupiers, to become those change agents?
Well, we are beginning to do that. There is both regulation on it, and I can tell you, I happen to chair a startup bank in the UK, beyond a startup bank, a challenger bank. We've been going for 10 years. We can't call ourselves a startup any longer. And we lend money in particular to real estate developers. And I can tell you that when we are, lending money against office space or retailing, we are looking at the energy efficiency of those. And many of the developers are doing the same, and they are improving the energy efficiency of buildings. And when you take old buildings and reconstruct them, you often achieve a very significant improvement in energy efficiency. And there is a labeling system which provides a metric of what we're achieving. So we are beginning to do that, and lots of good property developers are focused on that. We also need to encourage them not just to insulate better, but also to think about building energy management systems that make sure that you know which rooms are being occupied. You've only got the lighting on in particular occupied. You make sure that your heating and cooling systems are not running, over the weekend if they don't need to be running over the weekend. There's a lot of things you can do. The other thing, which of course is important, is rooftop solar. Solar PV is now getting so cheap that the opportunity for people to put solar on their roof, and also maybe to think about a battery as well, because battery energy storage is getting cheaper. This can enable people, for instance, to play these time of day tariffs. More in some countries than others. Very interesting. I was talking with Australian partners the other day. Australia is heading towards the environment where electricity is essentially going to be free between 11 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon.
Wow.
Because there's so much solar PV on the roof that the grid companies don't want to be sent any electricity because they don't know what to do with it. So, and then you have to install batteries so that you can shift it away from that period.
You have described in this report a range of really great interventions, and certainly it's recommended reading because there's an awful lot of really great information in there. What kind of global cooperation do you think is needed to avoid any kind of two-tier world where high-income countries, really can decarbonise while others perhaps fall behind?
Do you know, I think that's in all sense least important in some of the buildings area. We want everybody to go fast because we want to deal with the climate problem. But in terms of competitiveness, it doesn't matter if we're driving higher appliance efficiency standards in the UK and India is a bit far behind. There's no disadvantage to me. Where the international coordination becomes important is when you talk about decarbonising steel or cement production.
Yeah.
If you say to a European or UK steel company, you've got to decarbonise, and we've got a carbon price that encourages you to decarbonise, if there's still free trade in steel, you'll decarbonise, but you'll decarbonise by just closing your steel mill down and importing all your steel from India or China or Turkey. And that's why it's in these, what are called these, they're hard to abate, they're technically more hard to abate, they're expensive to abate, and they're internationally traded. And that's where you need either individual countries that go ahead, like Europe and the UK have an emissions trading scheme which sets the price of carbon, will have to have what's called CBAMs, carbon border adjustments, essentially carbon tariffs, or in shipping, you want to have a global carbon price, which is essentially what the International Maritime Organization has agreed to. So I'm not worried about countries going at a different pace in sectors of the economy where there isn't an international competitiveness problem because it's not traded. But when you get to things which are both energy intensive and traded, we need either globally coordinated approaches, or we need to accept that individual countries have an absolute right when they impose regulation and prices and another country doesn't, an absolute right to have a border carbon adjustment.
We got all the way through, almost to the end of the conversation without mentioning the word tariff, but we got there in the end. But no, success is going to largely be down to human behaviour, though. I mean, after a career of experience pulling groups together. I suppose two questions: how do you remain so positive about driving forward with this outcome, and how do you make sure that positivity actually delivered across the rest of the world to actually drive this decarbonisation challenge?
Well, I may come over as positive because that's because I feel one might as well be positive. Look, I assess the chances of success, and they're not as good as they were 6 months ago. I mean, the election of Donald Trump is a major shock to the system. I don't think we'll be able to limit global warming, sadly, to plus 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is what the low-lying island states wanted us to do and pushed us to do, because, their very existence is threatened by warming at 1.5. But I still think we can limit it to well below 2 degrees centigrade. And I think one should try. I mean, what makes me excited is the technological progress. I mean, let's take heat pumps. Heat pumps are getting more and more efficient. At the moment, they have coefficients of performance of 3 or 4. It's quite possible technologically to make them with coefficients of performance of 6 or 7 or 8. Electric vehicles are getting more and more efficient. Solar panels are getting cheaper and cheaper. I think we've got to create a sense for people of an opportunity here. And I think one of the crucial things always about politics in its widest sense, by which I mean not just party politics, but the process of persuading people. People are rarely persuaded by being told that life is awful and they've got to change in order to make it slightly less awful than it otherwise would. Because when you tell them life is awful, they'll pull the cover over their head and say, I'm not getting out of bed this morning. We've got to create a sense, which I think is justified, that we have the technologies to deal with this problem. And I think that is a crucial part of how we win this debate.
Brilliant. No, well, thanks so much. It's a hugely challenging topic, Adair, but thanks so much for helping clarify some of the challenges for it, but also thanks for sharing your enthusiasm and your passion and your solutions there. It's a really interesting report. I'll put a link to it in the show notes to make sure that everybody can have a read of it. So thanks very much for joining me on the Infrastructure Podcast today.
Thank you very much. Great. Bye-bye.
Sadly, that's all we've got time for today on the podcast, but there is more in the pipeline, more to discuss as we continue to probe the big issues facing this sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website, www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you will find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Lord Turner, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.